Okay, so today's topic is on chapter 23. We will talk about the motion artifact and flow compensation. So for previous classes, we have learned about the case space, the phase encoding concept, and spatial encoding concept. So this is very important for this for today's class to understand the flow compensation and flow related phase changes. And also the concept of segmented case space, because segmented case space is one way that you can easily see those ghosting artifacts that's related to motions. And also the Fourier transform, those Fourier transform theorems that can be a very useful tool when coming to analyze the artifacts and the flow related phenomenons. So today we'll first talk about the concept of flow compensation, why we need to compensate the flow effect and how we do that. And then we analyze some of the motion effects and the ghosting artifacts. Okay, so up to now, when we are talking about imaging the object, we are talking about imaging a static object. That means we always assume that every point of that object that it is being imaged, they remain at the same location throughout the whole scan. So what we call is the static object or static tissue. But when there is a motion related to those tissues, such as the blood, or sometimes the cardiac beating, or when you are breathing, your chest is moving. So these are the constitute the motion scenario that we have to deal with in MRI. So we have to come to understand what a moving spin would look like in an image, and what is the effect of the motion in MRI, in acquiring an MRI signal. So here this is the plot that shows the static versus the moving spin. Let's say first let's take a look at the readout direction. So for example, if there is a gradient, either it's a background gradient or it's an imaging gradient, it doesn't matter, as long as there is a gradient. And let's say there is a spin at the beginning of the excitation, for example. So if this is a static tissue or static spin, it will remain the same at the same location, regardless of the scanning process. So the phase, if we are looking at rotating what's the word? Rotating frame. That's right. If we are looking at it a rotating frame, it will not develop an additional phase, right? Because it remains at the same location. But if there is a motion, then this spin will move along the gradient, and it will seize a different magnetic field during the between the excitation and acquisition. So during this period, it will have developed a different phase than its original position. So there will be a additional phase added to this spin. So if there is a constant movement, a velocity or flow of this spin, and there is a gradient that is also along the direction of its movement, then it will induce a signal phase in the image. So we know that the general expression of the phase in terms of a background gradient, or in terms of a gradient, is the it will be the phi equals gamma g if this a general expression and x t and dt. All right, so this is the gradient, this is the location. So if there is a constant velocity, so then this one will now become let's say tau. So the location is the function of its velocity and the function of time. So this is so when we're considering constant velocity, this is the phase that it will generate if this velocity is also along the direction of the gradient, right? So if we can immediately see that if there's no velocity, no movement, that v is 0, then this additional phase will also be 0. So this is the static spin case. Okay, so let's take a look at the readout, the case for readout gradient. So the readout gradient, we know that we would have pre-phase gradient immediately in front of the preceding the readout gradient, and the pre-phasing gradient has the half of the area as the total readout gradient. So if we look at if there is if we are looking at the static spin, then the phase it develop would just be first created by this pre-phasing gradient. The pre-phasing gradient will first dephase it, give it an initial phase right before the start of the readout gradient, and then the readout gradient, which has the opposite polarity than the pre-phasing gradient, will then refocus this phase effect. So at the center of the readout, or where the echo is created, the static spin will see a next phase of 0 develop due to the gradient. But if there is constant velocity of that spin, this phase will have changed from through a different route. So that means at the center of the echo, this additional phase caused by its movement, caused by its motion, will not be 0. So that means there is a phase difference at the center of for the echo. So that means the signal we collect now will have a shift in the phase. So if you remember the phase shift simulation we did on chapter 20, I think, you'll see that this will be induce a phase inconsistency inside the K space, which will lead to artifact. Okay, so let's first take a look at the. Okay, so the conclusion from this slide is that a non-zero velocity will lead to an additional phase in the image. Okay, so let's take a look at a model for the vessels, because most of the time what we are interested in is the motion, the moving spins inside the blood. So let's take a look at the model of the vessel. So if we can either model the vessels with the constant plug flow, that means the flow is the same, has the same velocity throughout the profile of its of the vessels, and the other one is the laminar flow. That means this is a more realistic model. For laminar flow, the flow at the center of the vessel is faster than the flow at the edge of the vessels. So for a constant flow, we can use to practically as a model for the slow flow, usually sometimes for the veins or for the smaller arteries. So in the constant flow, as we saw before, although the signal phase will change, will also change due to this constant velocity. But this phase change is universal within these vessels. So that means there is because all the spins, they still have the same phase now, either due to they have the same velocity. Then that means its magnitude image, it will remains the intensity of its magnitude will remains unchanged. Although the phase image will have a phase that is affected by the flow. But for the laminar flow, because it has spatially varying flow, that means it will create a spatially varying phase in different parts of the vessels. So if we are collecting a voxel size that contains all these spins inside this vessel, that means will contain different spins that has different phase. So when we have spins with different phase within a single voxel, then it will lead to it will be effectively dephasing effect. So that means the vector sum of all the spins will be a smaller value than its original state. So that means the laminar flow, which is practically the fast flow scenario, like in the major arteries or the major veins, there will be a signal dephasing inside the vessels. So we will be seeing the magnitude, intensity of the vessels. It will be decreased if there is a flow-related phase changes. So to avoid such flow-related signal reduction, we need to do velocity compensation. So let's see the case for the readout. So from before, we can see that the expression of this additional phase caused by the motion, caused by the flowing velocity, is this integration of the gradient and its velocity. But let's assume it's constant velocity, so we can move this velocity term outside the integration. And if we want to remove this this additional phase, so that means we need this phase to be zero. So let's say if this is so this term would then be required to be zero. So let's say there is a non-zero velocity, then the final goal is to achieve to make this term zero. So this is just simply the gradient, the integration of the gradient and time. Okay. So by making this term to be zero, then we can achieve a flow compensation. So and we also now according to this, we define this term to be the first gradient moment. So if you remember previously when we were doing the readout, analyzing the condition for creating a gradient echo, we mentioned that the zeroth moment of the gradient must be zero. So the zeroth gradient moment would be when this n equals zero. So it's just the integration of the gradient over time. So in the sequence design plot. The diagram, that means we are looking at, for the zeroth gradient moment, we are looking at area of that gradient. So the definition of the nth gradient moment now is just simply like this. So in this, to achieve velocity compensation, that means we will have to achieve first gradient moment nulling. So we call the gradient moment nulling condition as this. So so it's very simple. Just make sure that the value is 0 by adjusting the polarities of the gradient and duration of different gradient lobes. So practically speaking, when we do the achieve gradient moment nulling for the zeroth gradient moment, we have achieved a static compensation of the gradient effect. So that means we can create a gradient field, a gradient echo for the static spins. And then if we achieve the first gradient moment nulling, as we just see, we can achieve velocity compensation. And furthermore, if we want to further achieve higher gradient moment nulling, like the second order, then we can also compensate for those spins that has a constant acceleration. Okay, so here are some examples of how we achieve the gradient moment nulling. So here is a simple bipolar gradient pairs. So it's basically two identical gradient lobes, but just play out consecutively, but just with opposite directions. So in here we can see that the first moment gradient, the first gradient moment. The zeroth gradient moment is 0 because the area of these two gradient lobes, they cancel each other. But we can see that first moment. So that means whenever there is zeroth gradient moments nulling, we know that it can be generated. It can be used to generate a gradient echo. So we can consider this as the prephase gradient, and this is the first half of the real gradient, right? But in this case, we can see that the first gradient moment, it is not 0, and neither is the second order gradient moment. So that means if the spin is moving or accelerating, which is very common for the blood, because of the positivity of the heart. So that means there will be an extra phase developed for those spins. So here is another 1 minor 2 and 1 gradient lobe play out. So we have one unit of area for this gradient lobe and -2 unit gradient area here, and then another 1 unit of the gradient area here. So for this 1-to-1 play out, we can see that, of course, the zeroth gradient moment is also 0 because their area is some of their area is also 0. But then we can see that the first gradient moment now also becomes 0. So that means if the phase develop associated with its velocity is also now 0. So that means the flow effect, the flow induced phase effect is now cancelled or compensated. But we can see that for this gradient play out, we can see that the second order gradient moment, it is still not 0. So this play out is usually what we call the flow compensation gradients play out, but it does not compensate the effect of the acceleration. So to compensate the effect of acceleration, we need a little bit more playout, more gradient lobe and sophisticated lobes. So this is the 1 minus 3, 3 minus 1 playout. So this one is the area is 1 in here, and then the area is minus 3, positive 3, and minus 1. So in this playout, we can see that all the moments, all the 3 orders of the gradient moments, they can achieve, they can be return to 0 at the end of this whole playout. So that means this 1, 3, 3, 1 playout can compensate the effect, even with the acceleration effect. But the cost of doing this is, of course, you need to play a more complicated play out of the gradients. You have to give 4 gradient lobes that will require a longer time to do that, and may also possibly generate more eddy current effect. So most of the time, practically, people just use this 1-to-1. Mostly just use this 1-to-1 playout to achieve compensation for the constant flow. And also practically speaking, it's difficult for you to find some spins with constant acceleration rate in the body, because even though the heart is beating, the acceleration is back and forth, from positive to negative. So it's not realistic to do compensation on the acceleration effect. So practically, the playout, as we see before, when you are designing a sequence, you cannot design a sequence with infinite ramp up and ramp down rate. So we need to do trapezoidal gradients. So this is the gradient moments that is associated with it. But also, as long as we use a 1-to-1 playout, where we basically can get a zero first moment nullning for the gradients. Okay, so here is the velocity compensation effect. So without a velocity compensation, so let's say this is the readout direction, right? So without the compensation, we can see that the phase, there is a phase change when there is a flow, flowing through this tube. But after the compensation, this phase now is, this additional phase is now, becomes 0 because the flow compensation. So it appears as if it's like a static, like the fluid inside the tube is also static. And this is on the phase imaging. On the magnitude imaging, if we do not compensate the velocity, and if this flow is also flowing very fast, as in those major arteries in the neck, we can see that those laminar flow would create a significant signal loss in those arteries. But if we perform a velocity flow compensation, we can correctly reconstruct the signal intensity within those vessels. All right. So when we are we only talk about velocity compensation along the single echo, for example, the single echo gradient echo case. So as we saw before, to improve the scanning speed, to reduce the total scanning time, most of the time we can use a segmented case-based approach. So with segmented case-based approach, we will be using a multi-echo scan. So for multi-echo gradient echo, we usually we play out a series of alternating readout gradients to obtain the to collect the k-space lines. So this is the what's showing here in the blue lines, they are the actual readout gradients from the gradient multi-echo gradient sequence that is generated by Siemens. So I directly copied this data form from its sequence design tool. So and then I calculated its gradient moments. So these black lines, they are the zeroth gradient moment, and these red lines, they are the first gradient moment. Now, because the first gradient moment is a function of the square of the time, so we can see that the first gradient moment would alternate from with a higher and higher values. But when we see that, if we see take a look at when they return to zero, when this gradient moment returns to zero. So for the zeroth moment gradient, for the zeroth gradient moment, we can see that it always goes back to zero at the center of the readout, right? Or the center of the readout. So that means we can successfully collect a gradient echo at the center of each readout. But for the first gradient moment, we can see that. So these two are the phase flow compensation gradient. This is the first readout. So we can see that for the first readout, its first order gradient moment is zero. But for the second readout, it is not zero at the center of the echo. So that means that at the second TE, at the echo center of the echo, there is additional phase in the signal collected by the second k-space lines. But for the third echo, it become the value, the M1 value also becomes zero. So we can see all from here. For this bipolar multi-echo readout trains, only the odd echoes can possibly be flow compensated, but even echoes they are not. And there is also one more condition for this to be true, is that we need to play out the readout gradients with the same amplitude and duration. So if you play out this readout with a different amplitude or duration for different echoes, this may not be true, because you know that to make sure that the first order gradient moment to be zero, it has to be both the gradient amplitude and durations must be carefully set. Okay, so yes.
So I couldn't understand why the odd and even echoes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So why the notation for odd and even echoes are not the same? I mean, for odd echoes we have each location, right?
Yes.
So, but for the even one, they are exactly at the same place as the real echo.
Right, but
What's the reason for it?
But for the M1, it is basically So it's G and tau, d tau. So if we have everything almost simply, so M1t is actually proportional to G and tau square. So when you see that, if you just use this relation, you can actually calculate the M1 value at the center of each readout. So it will be 0 for the odd echoes if the first echo by itself is already flow compensated. But this value will not be 0 for the even echoes. So it's just you can just simply do a calculation on this. Actually, to calculate this is easy, and also we have also observed this phenomena. So if we collect a multi-echo image, actually I should have put that as an example because I have already seen this. That we collected multi-echo sequence, multi-echo gradient echo, and we use each echo to create an independent image with different TEs. So we can see that for those images that's acquired using those even echoes, the flow is actually dephased already. But for all the odd echoes images, they have flow compensated effect, so we can reconstruct the vessels. So next time I should put them down. Okay. So the velocity, we just talk about flow compensation on the readout. So how about the flow compensation along the slice legs? So if just the same as the readout, if we do not have any flow compensation, if we just play out the readout gradient, if we just play out the slice select gradient along with the RF pulse and assumes that RF pulse takes an instant effect at its center, so that we only need a simple bipolar gradient, right? Simple bipolar gradient to achieve 0 gradient moment nullning. So it's the simple way that we usually see for the slice select gradient, and it's the slice select rephase gradient. But similarly, if there is also a movement along the slice select direction, then there will be an additional phase associated with the movement itself. So it will lead to a signal loss with the motion related dephase. So it's basically the same scenario as in the readout. So this is the 2D case. So achieve velocity compensation on the slice selection is the same as as with the readout case. So we just perform 1-to-1 play out of the gradient lobes in here, and we can achieve both nulling, achieve nulling for both the 0th grade and the first gradient moment after the play out in here. So and then we do everything else to the readout after this one. So there will not be any additional phase associated with the motions along the slice select, as long as this its first gradient moment is compensated along the slice selection gradient direction. But for the 3D case, if we also play it out like this, and then we then need to insert partition encoding gradient table. But because of this because of this play out by itself is already first moment node. So by inserting an extra partition encoding table, that means this partition encoding table will not be flow compensated. So we'll need to talk about phase encoding direction, flow compensation, in a different separately. So because it will be a little bit different. So before we go to the to talk about the flow compensation along the phase encoding direction, we need to understand the calculation of the gradient moment, especially with its time origin. So because the definition of the gradient moment is the time, the gradient and its time, the integration of the gradient and its time with different orders. So if we'll be able to do any to do an integration, and if we want to set it to an arbitrary time origin to do this integration, because as we see before, we can see that because this for the first first gradient moment, we can see that it is definitely a time varying, a time dependent function. So if we now from here we start the calculation when we start playing out the gradients. But and this we can see that we can be sure that this values at different points will be different if we set integration time origin, if we set it before this, for example, at the center of the RF excitation, right? So this will give you a different values. So how do we correctly set this time origin for the gradient moment calculation? So so here is the time origin in a general nth moment calculation. Can be arbitrarily chosen only when all the lower order moments of that gradient waveform are zero at the point of interest. So for example, at TE. So this would apply to both readout and slide select. So what does this mean? So let's go back. Let's go back to take a look at readout. So let's take a look at, for example, let's consider this is that the flow compensation along the readout. This will include both the prephasing, and let's consider consider this as the first half of the readout gradient. So the total readout gradient will be extended out of this window here a little bit. Okay, so so now the calculation here, we can start the calculation point. The time origin for the integration for the first gradient moment at this point, and we have and the integration would be from this point to this point, which is the center of the echo. So now because this we can see that with this playout, with this kind of playout. The first moment, the zeroth moment, and the first moment, they are zero. So that means if we extend the time origin to the, for example, to the readout. To the center of the RF excitation, and we start the calculation in here, it will still give you the same result, the same. Zero, the node zeroth and first moment. So that means as long as we know that at this point of TE, for example, this is the TE, right? So at this specific point, we know that zeroth moment is zero. Then we can use any arbitrary time origin to calculate the first moment of all these gradients. and we can be sure that it will also be zeroed at here at this part. So, and also for the slide selection, it is also the same case. Now we know that for any time point after all these gradients, starting at this time point, we will have zero. We will have zeroth moment and first moment, right? So we will definitely have a zeroth moment. So to calculate the first moment for any time point in here, it is okay that we can start. Well, basically we need to only can start here, but mathematically we can start the calculation, the time origin of that integration at any time point, as long as it only include this part. But it is a little bit different for the phase encoding. For the phase encoding case, because for phase encoding, is something like this. We have a non-zero zeroth moment, because we need to have a different phase encoding step, right, along here. So the zeroth moment along the phase encoding gradient, they will not be zero anytime after it's play out. So we cannot use any arbitrary time origin for its calculation. So we have to use a specific time for the calculation. So usually we would use the TE as the time origin. Okay, so this is the velocity compensation on the phase encoding. So if there is no compensation on the phase encoding, what would happen? Now let's consider let's take a look at the phase encoding. So usually we play out the phase encoding in a phase encoding table. So we usually just keep a constant time of the phase encoding gradients, but we vary the amplitude of the phase encoding gradients to achieve a certain gradient moment, for a zeroth gradient moment for the phase encoding, for different phase encoding steps. So let's say, so this means we perform this phase encoding before the readout of the signal. So that means when we do the phase encoding, and we encode we encode the spatial information of the moving spin at this instant of the when we play out the phase encoding gradients. But after we play out the phase encoding gradient, and if the spin moves from point A to point B, but during this movement, this change of location, because there is no more gradients, right? There is no more gradients between these 2 points. So that means there is no phase, no additional phase for these moving spins. Does that make sense? Right? Because if there is a gradient here, there will be additional phase, as we saw before. But now, after the phase encoding gradient has played out, and until the signal is being read as the echo center, there is no more gradients along the phase encoding direction. So there will not be any new additional phase that is for these moving spins along the phase encoding direction. So that means the spatial information for these spins along the phase encoding direction is still for its original location. Right? So so when we do the reconstruction, since the Fourier transform, right? As long as it has everything the same. So basically, we can say that in terms of the phase encoding information, this spin will have the same as this one. So that means for the reconstruction, it will be reconstructed at the same location along the phase encoding direction. So that means So that means this spin now would appear at the original direction when the phase encoding gradient is played out. Okay, so this motion, this is misregistration is caused by the motion that is between the phase encoding and echo center. So it's the between the phase encoding and the TE. So it's the motion during this periods that counts. And also motion along the readout is needed to see this kind of misregistration. So that's why you are seeing this phantom is being imaged at a tilted angle. Because if it's not tilted, so if it's perfectly along the phase encoding direction, and we have a long enough tube here, right? So the long enough tube here. Even though this one, this spin now will be misregistered to here, but it will not affect anything in the magnitude, because for this point, it will be filled up by the spin at this point. So you will still be seeing the whole original signal. Although it is the signal you're seeing should not be appearing, should not appear at that position, but you cannot tell, because if it's infinite long tube that is directly along the phase encoding direction, you cannot see it. But you need to have a motion, a readout, a certain component of the motion is also along the readout, or anything that is perpendicular to the phase encoding direction to see this kind of misregistration artifacts. So to achieve flow compensation along the phase encoding, we need to achieve both goals. The first goal is to achieve phase encoding functions. So that must be done in order to give you a good expected image. And also we need to achieve the zeroth node first moment for the gradients. So when we are doing this, usually we use a bipolar gradient, but they may be with a different amplitude or duration. And for this bipolar gradient, we need them to satisfy these two conditions, and then we can calculate its solutions. So we know that for given the FOV and the resolution and a given total duration of this, we can calculate the strength, the amplitude for the gradients, for these two gradient lobes. And for to achieve different phase encoding steps, we can simply just do our scaling, a direct scaling of these two gradients, so that you can achieve different phase encoding steps while keeping the first moment being zero. But remember that as we saw before, because the the zeroth moment is not zero, so we cannot use an arbitrary arbitrary time origin to calculate this first moment. So we need to set the time origin at TE. So that means if we first play out this flow compensation gradients along the phase encoding, and we decide to change the TE. We want to use a longer TE. Then we would also need to dynamically update these two gradients as well to achieve the flow compensation effect. Otherwise, so this one will not be fixed if you want to use a different TE. Okay, so motion can create a lot of trouble, especially if you give you a lot of different kinds of artifacts. So one of them is the most famous ghosting artifact. So the ghosting artifact is caused by the phase inconsistency in the K-space. So for constant motion, actually there will not be any ghosting artifact, because for constant motion, the phase, there will be a phase shift, but this phase shift will be the same for for the overall K-space. So that means there is no phase inconsistency in the K-space. So for constant motion, you can see the signal change, a phase shift, but you do not see any ghosting artifacts. So usually what we are seeing a ghosting artifact will be for those positive or periodic motion, such as the the pulsatility within the vessels, caused by the beating heart, or the respiration. Right? We are breathing, so we have a periodic motion of the chest. So that will also create a very ghosting artifact. So in here, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly. We have some ghosting artifacts that is caused by this internal cerebral arteries. So because it's pulsating, and also we can also see the most widely seen artifact, ghosting artifact, is here on the eyeball, because during the whole scan, whole 3D scan, the eyeball is always have some kind of involuntary motions and kind of like random motion. So sometimes random bulk motion can also give you different ghosting artifacts, but because it's random, you may not be able to see it clearly as the spatial frequency of the ghosting artifact may not be that clear to you because of the random nature of those motions. So usually you may be seeing a lot of ghosting artifacts with different strength and different spatial frequencies that overlap with each other. So you may not be easily tell. And also the bulk motion can also be lead to a ghosting artifact. So this is a bulk motion. The head is moved, juggle a little bit during the whole scan, and then we can see that for this one, it's a very nice demonstration of the ghosting artifact. It shows you a repetition of your of the whole of the brain with a certain spatial frequencies. And because we can also see a different spatial frequencies. For example, here is a lower spatial frequency, while in here, these ones, they are much higher repetition of the ghosting artifact. So that means you properly move during the acquisition of the K-space center, so that you can so that it created this low spatial frequency artifact, while you move. Or you also move when it's collecting the edge of the K-space, so that you can see those high spatial frequency components. So we can also see this with a few simulation I did to see how this spatial frequency of the ghosting artifact comes about. So the probability of ghosting artifacts would be that first is direction is basically always along the phase encoding direction, or the partition encoding for that sake. But mostly is phase encoding. So we can, whenever you see a ghosting artifact and you see the ghosting artifact directions, you can immediately tell which direction is being the phase encoding direction. So usually, according to these properties, usually we would set the phase encoding direction from along the left and right direction, so that this kind of artifacts, or this kind of artifact caused by the aims, caused by the eyes, they do not, go along, go into the brain, right? They do not go along this direction and overlap with the brain. And also the spatial frequencies, as we discussed before, it will depend on when that motion takes place during the acquisition of the K-space. And also the amplitude of the ghosting artifact. So it would, most of the time it will appear to be high pass filtered. So in the book, it gives you some extensive analysis using the mathematical analysis using the Bessel functions. But another simple explanation is that most of the time, because the center of the K-space is usually only a small part of the whole K-space, especially when you go with high resolution. So chances are your movements will be during the acquisition of some higher spatial frequency. So that means these ones, they are not, if the motion is not exactly at the center of the K-space, usually you would have the ghosting artifact looks like a high-pass filter, because it does not, because those K-space lines that has a phase change, they do not contain those baseline signals, so that you basically can observe the ghosting artifact as if it's high-pass filtered. So for the solution to remove or reduce the ghosting artifact, of course, first we need to do a good flow compensation, so that there is no phase inconsistency in the K-space, for that matter. And for the bulk motion induced ghosting artifact, we can also do the cardiac gating. We only collect the data at a certain phase of the cardiac cycle. We do a breath hold. We hold the breath so that there is more motion in the chest. And also we use some restriction measures to fix the body parts, like the head, so that you don't move around. And also to remove the ghosting, to reduce ghosting, most of the time a shorter TE can help. So if you scan this image with a much shorter TE, chances are this ghosting artifact will be removed or reduced. And also, a very effective method to do this is to use single-shot imaging. Those like EPI or single-shot turbo speed echo, because it is collected. We collect the whole image within a few hundred microseconds. Then you can avoid motion induce phase inconsistency in the whole K-space. Okay, so here's some. I did some simulations on the ghosting artifacts. So we can, use the theorem, the Fourier transform theorem, to do this analysis. So the linearity theorem is that you can directly add two. If you add K-space. Adding the two K-space is equivalent to adding the two images. That is the Fourier transform of that K-space, right? So let's say this is the full image, right? It has the full K-space, everything. So this is the magnitude, and this is the phase. Now there is some noise, but we can see that there is clearly there is only one object at the center. And if we just simply extract its odd K-space lines and even K-space lines, and then we do directly do a Fourier transform, then we can obtain an alias image, because we have now half of the effective FOV, right? So we can see that in terms of the magnitude, of course, these two subset of the K-space will give you very similar, because it's just only every other lines. So they basically cover almost the same center of the K-space and the edge of the K-space. So the amplitude, they look basically the same. But for the phase image, we can see that for the center, for the location where the original object is located, they have the same phase. But for those wraparounds, they have an opposite phase. So that means if you, because in K-space, if we add these two sub-K-space together and do a Fourier transform, we can directly get this. So in the image domain, if we complex, add them together, right? Because their phase, you can see the phase. This is the same, and this is the opposite. Adding them together will also give you the same results. So that means this wraparound is, can give you the same result. So there is no phase inconsistencies in this case. So the next one. If we have a certain kind of phase shift in the even lines, so we keep the odd lines the same, and we add the phase shift in even lines, and let's see what the results look like as a function of this phase shift. All right, one more again. So first, this time we first look at the magnitude image. The magnitude image. Now this comes around, this disappears, this comes back, and this disappears. So the phase shift is from 0 to 2 pi, right? So we can see that if there is when the phase shift in even lines is exactly 1 pi. Now that means it basically the phase, because there is a phase shift in the K-space, right? Means also what do you mean? Let me see. Phase shift in let me give you. Phase shift in K-space. No, a constant phase shift. Okay, yes, a constant phase shift in the K-space would give you a linear a linear phase shift in the image. So when the this phase shift is 1 pi for the even lines, that means that it's basically the even lines now would appear. The image reconstructed by the even lines would basically appears the same. Let me see. It's the opposite. It should be the opposite of the odd lines. So that means the original object now is they will cancel out, basically cancel out, while the aliased object, they will be additional, will be constructively added together. And then it goes on, and when it reaches 2 pi, it will be the same before. And then we also take a look at, for this one time, we take a look at the phase. So when this will go in, and then suddenly it will change signs. All right. Okay. So so that means when the phase shift in the even lines changes, we can see both the phase and the magnitude of the outcome. The final image will also change, and we can see the ghosting. This is actually the ghosting now in this kind, in this sense, because this is now a full K-space. Right. So another. Okay, so that's one for the even lines. So if there is a phase shift in 1 in every 3 lines. So for in 1 in every 3 lines, that means that spatial frequency of the ghosting will also be 3 times. So that means the effective FOV of that of this lines would be 1/3 of the original. So we can see that the spatial frequency of the ghosting is related to this phase inconsistency in the K-space lines. So let's also take a look at it, how it changes. Right. Right. So basically, same. Okay. So what's shown here is because this one we only have 1 K-space line for every 3 lines. So this one is the aliasing artifact. But for the one is shown here, because we are adding these 2 K-space together, so this is a fully acquired K-space. So this one is not the aliasing artifact, but it's ghosting. So let's take a look at the other ones. Okay, so if we have a phase shift in 1 in every 10 lines, okay, see, we can see this ghosting artifact now. It depends. Can you see this center part? Yeah, this is also a ghosting artifact just like this, but just without the center part. And from the phase image, you can see that this ghosting artifact is very clearly shown here. So that means the phase shift, the ghosting artifact is depending on where the motion or those phase shift takes place in the K-space. If this phase shift takes place in outer part of the K-space, then you will observe a higher spatial frequency. And if it takes place at the center of the K-space, then you will see a low reposition, low spatial frequency of the ghosting artifacts. Right? Okay, so the last part is just introduce the maximum intensity projection method. So usually when we are doing imaging, for example, the vessels, because the vessel itself is very small, it only most of the time it may only be shown on one slice, and because the vessels, they are tutorials, and it may different segment of that vessels may appear at different slices, so it's very difficult to track the vessel or evaluate the vessels if just by viewing the image slice by slice. So the maximum intensity projection is that we dedicate a certain projection direction, and then we outline that signal profile along the direction, and then we do just collapse them and just take the maximum value for this slab, for this certain slabs range, so that we can then show the blood vessels in this final MIP image. So this one, so if this is the slice, for example, if this is the slice direction, just like showing here, and we have the vessels on one slice here, and then the next part is done another slice and first slice. But after the projection, it really doesn't matter which slice the vessel segments are located. They will be all shown in the same final MIP image. So it can be much easier to it can be much easier to track the vessels. So in here, this is the original slice, just one slice image. So we can so this is one slice image. We can see those vessels as bright dots, but we do not there's not much useful information, and we cannot see clearly how these vessels, the trajectory of these vessels. So if we do a maximum intensity projection over the neighboring 8 slices, so we can clearly depict the trajectory of some vessels, and this is a very nice one. But if we do a projection over the whole imaging slab, which is 84 slices in this case, we can see even more. We can see even a longer trajectory of the vessels, because now it contains all the information of the vessels. But we are also seeing those high signals from the scalp. So this would then interfere with the viewing of this final images. So when doing a maximum. Okay. So when we're doing a maximum intensity projection or minimum intensity projection, sometimes for SWI, if we do that, so we will need to understand. We will need to consider the spatial range for the projection. So so how many slices we should choose to give you the best view of the vessels you want to see, but to avoid those unwanted signals from other high intensity structures. And also we need to we can do a MIP along different arbitrary angles if we are doing a 3D high resolution imaging. So in here we are doing this in a transverse plane, but we can also do this in a sagittal or coronal plane or any other oriented imaging planes. And we can also create a MIP image for different viewing angles, and then we put them together to form a movie, to form a small movie. It's just showing like it's rotating the whole vessel networks. And we also need to take into consideration for the imaging resolution and image contrast. So we'll be talking about MRA in the next class. So for the MR angiography, we need to choose the best imaging resolution as and to obtain the best image contrast in an acceptable imaging time. Another hyper-intense structures, as in here, the scalp, because the FAT has a short T1, so you will have a higher signal in this kind of T1 weighted images. So it will, if we use a too thick a snap, then it will interfere with the final results. And also another problem of the MIP is that it's difficult for you to localize the vessels. So for the single slice, you definitely can be sure that this vessel, this segment of the particular segment of the vessel is located within this slice. But for this one or this one, you can see the whole vessel, but you don't know how this exactly along which slice this particular segment is located in, and you do not know how it's curved along this direction, along the projection direction. So basically you have flattened all those informations along the projection direction. So most of the time you may need to create a movie using different MIP angles to properly locate a vessel. Okay, so this is only two problems for this section, and next section we'll talk about chapter 24 on the MR angiography and different techniques for MR angiography, and also the phase contrast MRA and flow quantification. All right.